In late June 2015, an Army sergeant with his wife, 2 young children, dog, and a cat began moving from Hunter Airfield down here on the Atlantic Ocean with the idea that he's being transferred up to Fort Carson, and this is the route that they want to go. And their plan was to go through Atlanta and Nashville, Tennessee. And he sets it for the route, and the family planned to travel at night when it was cooler with less traffic and then stay in motels during the day. Sergeant CJ, as I call him, and his wife were shocked when a bright white light in the sky suddenly came down toward them. The Army sergeant estimated that the disc hovering above their truck was 820 feet in diameter, it's nearly 3 football fields, and was nearly 200 feet high. Sergeant CJ drove up the road a few miles and found a Shake Rag Express on Highway 1 South. And when he tried to get out of the truck, he said his legs felt like wet noodles, as if he couldn't stand up, and he didn't know what was wrong. But the greater shock was when he bought some food, and the Shake Rag Express receipt showed they were in Wadley, Georgia, way off his GPS course. This is where they were going. This is Wadley, Georgia. Something happened that took them up this course, this very rural, very few people, town of a couple hundred people, mostly rural. Somehow they got there. That the diversion on Route 1 north to the rural countryside of Wadley, Georgia, was under the control of some unknown intelligence in order to transmit binary information into Sergeant CJ's mind. First, Sergeant CJ and his wife were so confused about what had happened as CJ continued driving. Now he's on a road and he's going northwest to Atlanta. He said, no way am I going to sleep. We're going to watch the sky and we're going to get to Atlanta. And they decided to go a little further north to the Magnuson Hotel. And everybody was absolutely exhausted, he said. They laid down, the kids laid down, the dog, the cat, everybody went to sleep. But Sergeant CJ found himself with his eyes opening in this Motel 6 bathroom, and he is holding a ballpoint pen like this in his right hand, leaning against the door jamb, and in this hand, he's holding this, covered with squares and lines that trail off to WTF question mark. But more than anything, Sergeant CJ wants to know why. Why him? Why binary code that he can't seem to get stopped? Australian geneticist Horace Drew, PhD, volunteered to translate Sergeant CJ's squares and ones. And here is the first page where the red underline is showing this is what the math translation of the zeros and ones. It ended up with a capital C and then small case, continuous protection of humanity, what turns out to be a latitude, longitude, expose hidden KN knowledge to all. Going on to all citizens. Advancement imperative for planetary survival. Beware of Orion 1350.3 and Z Reticuli 39.1 question mark 70. Avoid signal messages sent. Now here, so it's more readable, is the whole translation for all the squares and the lines. That's it. And putting it up against ASCII code, assuming that it may be binary and not knowing, this is what comes out of straight doing the divisions and comparing them to ASCII code. Continuous protection of humanity, latitude, longitude, we're going to get into. Expose hidden knowledge to all citizens. Advancement imperative for planetary survival. Beware of Orion 1350.3 and Z Reticuli 39.1 question mark 70. Avoid signal messages sent. And what the Australian geneticist, when he was doing this, he sent me this note that said the two coded numbers 1350.3 and 39.170 are the distances. That when you go to a star map, then you find out that the Orion Nebula is 1,350 light years from Earth, and the binary star system of Zeta Reticuli is 39.17 light years from Earth. And further, Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 is supposed to be the original solar system source of the gray aliens. If you go back to 1961 and the Betty and Barney Hill case in New Hampshire, where the couple encountered those gray ETs. And this is the famous case where, under hypnosis, Betty Hill had drawn a star map. She said it was three-dimensional, and the gray with the black lenses on the eyes was showing him and showing her and asking her where was she on this holographic map, and she said she didn't know, but she was able under hypnosis later to draw it, and she was able under hypnosis to say here are trade routes, here is our sun, here is Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, and that was back in the early 1960s. And that final line, avoid signal messages sent, seems to relate to Sergeant CJ's dream information about the danger for Earth when we send out SETI signals without knowing who is on the other end. By comparing Sergeant CJ's string of zeros and ones to Sergeant Jim Peniston's back on December 26, 1980. That was the night that Sergeant Peniston, with Airman First Class John Burroughs and Airman Ed Kavansak, were ordered into Rendlesham Forest to investigate strange colored lights that were moving around in the tall forest that was on civilian land that ran along RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge, which at the time was NATO's largest airbase. This is page 1 of the binary code by Peniston. Here are these red lines are segmenting off the zeros and ones, and here's this equals capital E, capital X, capital P, capital L, capital O, and so forth. Exploration of humanity. Lots of argument about what happens here in the translation. Remember, Peniston has said that just like CJ, that the zeros and ones were going right to left. And in Peniston's case, for more than a day and a night, they wouldn't leave. And he had been home and he was very frustrated, wondering if he should go to a doctor. He couldn't get these zeros and ones. And suddenly a thought voice came into Peniston's head. Write them down. And he went to a desk, pulled out his notebook, wrote down the zeros and ones. This is what he says, and this is what you're looking at. And this number 8100, the next page, we have another latitude, longitude, and the word continuous for planetary advance. Fourth coordinate, continuous question mark, all caps CEPR question mark, the word before, and then it trails off. It's the end. And after he had written these down in his notebook, the screen completely went blank. and it was over for Peniston. Then, after we got that first code, he came back with more pages of code that he said was in his notebook and that he had not shared. This latitude, longitude, and ends up with explaining, these are words in part of the binary, origin year 8100. Now, what's important is none of the Peniston binary had any designation of a decimal point. And if you do not have a designation of a decimal point, you have to then calculate, depending upon how far you want it to go out, as many as the astrophysicist said, there's at least 24 options for each of these latitude-longitude combinations. Let's now compare Sergeant CJ's first June 30th, 2016 binary translation on the top to 35 years before. Here's Peniston's. And the words that stand out as similar are continuous, humanity, advance, planetary, survival. 35 years apart, binary code, Peniston's Air Force, CJ is Army. Sort of similar communications. And just to show you how this works in a crop formation here, see how they're in clumps. This is binary code. And this shows you in the beginning, the 0, the 1, the 0, 0 over here. This is the beginning. This was a capital B. And it continued B, E, W, A, R, E, and all the rest of it. And here is what it said. Beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Much pain, but still time. Believe there is good out there. We oppose deception. Conduit closing. Dr. Drew thinks some of it warns about a Trojan horse event coming to Earth. He wonders if the Trojan horse is an invasion attack by the gray ETs from Orion and Zeta Reticuli that have been warned about in Sergeant CJ's binary code. Sergeant CJ did receive more telepathic downloads coming into his head at night. He said the squares and lines came faster than before, so it was hard for him to write it all down. Then he began to notice that some of the squares were darkened. From October 27th to the first week of January 2016, Sergeant CJ said, I want to understand what this is about. And he said, I'm going to try to concentrate even harder on these dark shadings in the squares. And finally, he thought that he was getting some of it. So now we had new way to approach this. The Horace Drew from Australia started doing searches on the web for anything that would be like the squares and the ones, and found at www.thinkersmith.org that they were working with a binary system of squares that were darkened and light. And he took the new shaded, showing the first translation, IMMINENT space, imminent, and came up, here's October 2015 to January 2016, imminent threat soon upon Earth's leaders and civilizations, expose and disband hidden knowledge to all citizens, employ safe and controlled joint study to all minds, progression imperative for combined survival, embrace this space vessel threat, 000 journey 12 light years, AIS, close, evolve, 6 ones. Royal Emerther, all caps, warning. Expose foreign technology to all. Evolutionary advancement needed to prevent takeover. Brackets, the number 3 and a quote mark. And then, on February 18, 2016, Sergeant CJ found that he had added 5 new lines of squares and lines without darkening any of them. And he emailed me, quote, "This was fast, and I was unsure if I drew them down correctly. But I sent them to the Horace Drew in Australia, and what came back as a surprise? Here are 5 categories of letters that translate from here." And he said, "All I know is that KI is ancient Sumerian for earth." So, not understanding what this was, I called up the University of Pennsylvania. I'd lived in, and I went to Professor Joshua Jeffers, PhD, research specialist, Royal Inscriptions of the Neo-Assyrian Period Project, University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, Babylonian section, Philadelphia. Here is his March 24th, 2016 reply. The first 2 words and the 4th word look to be Akkadian and not Sumerian. The first could be the god Nabu. I never heard of Nabu before this. So I started doing research and find out that Nabu was one of the 3 most important gods in Sumeria. I've talked about this translation with several people knowledgeable about Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, and they sum it up this way. The Sumerian Nabu is returning to earth in a chariot. The universe is built on sound patterns, which is why so many different worlds, dimensions can exist in the same space. Each is on a different frequency. You disrupt a world dimension to the point that you destroy the carrier wave it exists on, and you have created a hole in existence that cannot support the dimension above or below it. Each frequency, besides maintaining its own world dimension, also supports or holds in place the one above it and below it. Everything is interdependent. There are countless worlds, dimensions occupying the same space without being aware of one another because of having their own individual octaves. This octave frequency holds the world dimension in place and causes it to exist safely without interfering with or even being aware of other world dimensions around it. This frequency acts as a buffer zone to keep everything in its place. You do anything to disrupt it, and you begin a collapse that starts a deadly chain reaction. If the density of this collapse reaches a certain weight, space-time itself begins to collapse. Atomic and hydrogen bombs physically tear into other dimensions. With all their technology, why do the aliens need us abductees to speak for them? Something just doesn't make any sense. I wonder if we are being lied to, used for some purpose to put over ideas the aliens want us to believe. If there is an experiment, maybe if it succeeds, it will put us in competition with the aliens for something they don't want to share. Maybe they're trying to scare us out of their neighborhood.